Are you familiar with the model minority myth? Today, my friend Tej is going to be on the podcast, and we're going to talk about the model minority myth and how it impacts individuals of the Asian American community as well as different minority groups.
¿Qué onda? Soy Sebastián y este podcast es Otomi. For all of my non-Spanish native speakers, this is Sebastian, and I'm a high school student in the Bay Area. I've got the facts and the opinions. Join me as we discuss topics of society, culture, identity, education, and life. Today I'm here with my friend Tej, and we're going to be talking about the model minority myth. So could you describe your background and how your family immigrated here to the USA?
Yeah. So my parents were both born in India, and at a very young age, they immigrated to England for better educational opportunities. And from England, um, through an education or a student visa, they came to the United States, and that's how we all ended up here. So I guess my identity is Indian American, or yeah.
Great. Okay. So today the topic of discussion, at least what we're going to be talking about, is the model minority myth. Now, have you heard about the model minority myth?
Oh yeah, I've heard of it. I've heard of it before. Just internet news stuff like that.
Could you tell me from what you've heard, what do you believe the model minority myth to be?
I think it's a stereotype, especially against Asian people, in the sense that because Asian people are there are cases in which Asian people have high levels of success. Their whole race is stereotyped that Asians in America have a high level of success. Thus, other immigrants can achieve that same level of success um, in a similar way, if
Yeah,
that makes sense.
that's a very good way of explaining it. Basically, this usually tends to adhere to Asian Americans, and this includes Indian Americans and East Asian Americans, and how they're perceived by society and how that impacts other minority groups, because that has a big impact on the way that Hispanic, African American, the Black community is affected, because this is the model minority myth. Basically, is based on the idea that a minority group, which in this case would be Asian Americans, is able to achieve a higher economic success than the population average, which in this case, yeah, that minority group of Asian Americans has been able, at least I believe the average is able to achieve higher than the average American, if you're looking at it from a general perspective. Thus, the big issue though with this is that the success of these individuals is then used as a reference to other people who live within this country who are part of minority groups. And it's often used by conservative, usually individuals who are Caucasian and white. They use this as a reason to explain why other individuals who are minorities, their any explanation that they have for why they're in a lower socioeconomic status is not valid, because if you look at this example here, Asian Americans are able to excel in all these different things, and why for that reason you should be able to accomplish the same thing. Now, Tage, do you see any flaws in this?
Yeah, no, I think there's many flaws in that statement. It's that sure, immigration. There are many different countries that immigrate from many parts of the world, from many different continents into the United States. It is a melting pot of different cultures and different perspectives and different immigrants, right? It's a country founded on immigrants, besides the Native Americans here. But I think the biggest problem with this is immigrants are so diverse that it's impossible to put them into one category by saying because Asian Americans are, I guess, on average more educated or maybe in a higher or have higher economic status for some reason. You can't say that, okay, that race has higher economic status, therefore this other race that is non-American, I guess, is going to achieve that same level of success or those same levels of failures because they're completely different people. If we compared the Asian American population in the United States to the African American population, there's a completely different idea of systematic oppression that goes on in these different communities. For example, in areas with high African American population, you see lower paying jobs in some areas, high systematic oppression or racism, and these issues. There's so many more issues with all these different communities that I'm not going to talk about here because you hear it on the news every day, in which there's issues facing Hispanics or Hispanic immigrants because they are taking American jobs or because they are illegal or undocumented. African Americans, we all know what the racism that's facing them today, or the racism that they're facing today. But then Asian Americans, you don't really hear too much about their quote unquote struggle in America. And I just think it's wrong to throw all these different identities into one bubble because we treat America, right? We treat the country as a whole. If you think about America, you think about one of the most diverse countries in the world. But when you say all these immigrants are the same, you can't make that assumption because America is a country founded on immigrants. There are so many immigrants here. If you say the country is diverse, you have to say the immigrant populations are diverse. You can't have it both ways. So I don't think that model minority myth should be valid at all.
Exactly. I definitely believe. And another issue that pops up is just that it generalizes Asian Americans and Asian immigrants, and it fails to really address the differences in the varying ethnic groups. Because as it turns out, the majority of
Bhutanese.
Americans are below the poverty level, while Japanese Americans um, tend to be of a higher socioeconomic status than the average American. And see, there you have um, two different sides of the spectrum, two ends, and you have to acknowledge the fact that those are just false assumptions that people are making, and it's not really just to say that all Asian Americans have a certain level or expectation uh, just because of their own racial identity. Inherently, that's racist. So, but I'd say one of the bigger issues is the way that it also impacts other immigrants. Now, I've been watching videos, not really because I think that it's the most because I agree with it, but because I think it's good for me to expose myself to perspectives I don't agree to. I've seen some conservative YouTube channels and debates and things like that. And the purpose of it, of course, is to develop my own rhetorical skills to be able to, be persuasive and refute everything that they say. The thing is, there's a perspective that, and I've seen this through many of those. At least for me, I'd say they're notorious in a way. For the more liberal individuals, the Ben Shapiro's and those types of conservative commentators, I'd say some of their arguments are not very well founded in anything. They're not sound. And they've used this, individuals like that, to explain that the struggles that occur within African American and the Hispanic community are a cultural result and not at all a result of context, which of course is completely false. And then they also use it to discredit the idea of institutionalized racism, because they say that if the average Asian American is able to have a higher income than the average white man, then how is it possible? How is it possible that there's institutionalized racism? Now, inherently, it's just not the best argument, because in reality, the United States purposefully seeks out, because there's only a certain amount of immigrants that they accept every year. The immigrants that they do accept, they prefer for them, at least from Asia, even Africa. A lot of Africans, they have people come in to the country who have a better education, who are usually of a higher socioeconomic status within that country, where they have a better education, and therefore they're more appealing because the United States sees them as an individual who will help contribute to the society. Now, one thing I really don't like is that this idea of the model minority myth doesn't just align itself with Asian Americans. It also can be applied to Africans and African Americans.
So, something that a lot of people try to point out is just the idea that African immigrants make more money than their African American counterparts. And to some extent, this is true. Black men born in the United States earn usually an average of $24,000, according to research, a study done in 2010, while African immigrants in the same 2010 study average $45,000. So that's almost 2 times greater income than by black immigrants than black Americans. Additionally, black African male immigrants are actually very highly educated, as I said. They have far higher percentage of college education, being at 52%, compared to only 30% of white men born in the United States and 13% of black men born in the United States, according to a study. And also, 37% of black African female immigrants have a college education, compared to 27% of white women born in the United States and 17% of black US born women. So it would make sense that there are many conservative people who try to refute the idea of institutionalized racism by pointing to this, that there are African immigrants who are paid higher amounts than black individuals born in the United States, the African Americans. And people use this to say that the color of skin is not an issue when it comes to economic success. Yet, white men born in the United States earn an average of $49,478. As I said, compared to the average black American immigrant who makes $45,000 a year. And there you can see that despite the high level of education within the African immigrant population, many of them still don't make as much as the white people born in the United States because of racism, because of the color of their skin. And a lot of people try to say that that's not a factor, but it really is, because these African immigrants from Africa, they have high levels of education, but their ability to succeed is limited entirely by their race and their color. And it's not something cultural, which some people try to point to and say, oh, it's a cultural thing, but it's not. It is just the fact that there is an institutionalized racism in this country, and you can't deny that.
And that's why it's difficult for people from Latin America who don't have as much access to education. People don't really have a concept of how difficult it is to come here to the United States, and that's why many of them have to resort to illegal immigration. And then people call that delinquency, and I guess they say, oh, it's illegal immigration, but these undocumented immigrants, they're not bad people. They're people who have great family values and morals and ethics, and they deserve to be treated like any other human being and not treated as if they were animals to be locked up in a cage. And for that reason, people really need to change their perspective on the whole model minority myth. It also impacts the way that people perceive you as a person. I bet that you, as an Indian American, people tend to have a concept. Their perception of you is that you are quite intelligent, which you are. That I'm not denying that at all, but I'm saying it's kind of uh, due to the way that this country associates certain labels to different racial groups and ethnic groups. They would consider you to be more uh, intelligent, at least from the eyes of the model minority myth. And then for me, but before, multiple times people have said that I am smart for Mexican, which basically there shows you that ignorance in the idea that to have a certain intellectual capacity, you have to be of a certain racial or ethnic group. Tage, could you explain to me? I just said how people have often indicated that my race is an indicator of my own intelligence, but they've used it in a negative way, somewhat as an insulting manner to say that I am less capable of achieving because of racial um, my racial identity that and ethnic identity that for me I've had to control my narrative and not allow any of that to leak through into my self conception. I don't let that impact it because I know that it can be detrimental to certain people who are very sensitive to what others say. I'd say that I'm quite calloused in the fact that I can really take things like that and it doesn't really affect me because I know I'd say I have a stable self-esteem and self-concept to the point where what other people say really doesn't impact me because I'm aware of my own accomplishments and my own achievements and what I am capable of doing as well as what I'm not capable of doing. So yeah, I these labels for me, for inherent naturally uh, they're going to impact anyone in a certain way. They're going to impact me in a certain way, but it's not something that really causes me to have a decay in my morale. So, yeah, that was a long way of listing out my question, but could you explain really how at least society has placed expectations on you and how people have labeled you due to your race as an Asian American?
Yeah, I think in terms of society stereotypes, I think the way that it affects the individual isn't about what they should do as much as what they are not able to do. For example, in your example, there is a stereotype that Hispanic people aren't don't reach the highest level of education, in comparison to other races. That's just the stereotype in this country. Yet you are one of the smartest people that I know. You're definitely smarter than me, so you're one of the smartest people I know, and you're like,
No,
and that's for sure.
that's too generous for you to say.
No, but still, but the point I'm trying to get across is that when you were mentioning your stereotypes, you were saying how they don't expect you to be smart because that's one of the withdrawals of your stereotype. For my stereotype, being an Indian American, yes, there is the stereotype of being smart, and I try to achieve these goals through my own self-interest and my own self-drive. But I think where it really falls short is where the negative parts of the stereotype. For an Indian American that played high school basketball, it doesn't it not seeing maybe seeing like one or two other Indian players in the entire season, or maybe just five or something, and watching that, and it's kind of seeing like, why aren't there more of us here, because there's such a high population of us in this area. um, and I think there's just a slight subconscious tug that stereotypes put on people. But the interesting thing that I feel like in America is that there's such a high emphasis in America on individualism and being your own person and striving for your own goals. Yet that constantly gets confounded with the stereotypes of an entire race. Does that make If that makes sense? There's the individual aspect of America, that everyone should have their own identity, their own drive, their own goals, their own ability to reach their own economic status. Yet there's also these stereotypes that, hey, these people as a whole don't actually do this, or they do this exceptionally well, which I think is very wrong because, again, America's all about the individual and the individualist approach to life. And stereotyping people, especially focusing on the drawbacks of it and I guess not anticipating somebody to be as accomplished or as little accomplished as they are based on their race. I don't think that's right, because your race and your individual drive, your self-esteem, your self-accomplishments, your accomplishments in society, maybe there's a slight correlation between them. So maybe there's even a big correlation between them, but correlation does not imply causation. What could happen is that one explaining variable in this is that a certain group of people have higher emphasis on different things, or or as an example, people from immigrated families whose parents work very hard might have instilled that in their children from a young age. That doesn't mean that as a race of people, every single immigrant was instilled in these values. That's based on how their parents worked, regardless of their race. What I'm trying to basically say here is there's a distinguishing aspect between the individualistic approach and the necessary means of achieving in society, completely separate from race itself. So I think it's wrong to stereotype a race when, in fact, the real variable here isn't the race, but maybe the individual values that a lot of the people in the race might have. Because I think that's an important distinction to draw, that you can't characterize a whole race of people by maybe the value of like 51% of them. Maybe you can say, hey, that's a majority, and a majority of Indians believe this. But what about the 49% of us? There's a billion Indian people, or over a billion Indian people. Not all of those are Indian Americans, but you can't say that over 500 million of us are in a certain way because, well, I guess another 500 million might share a certain set of values. That's just completely wrong. You can't generalize those, like, you can't make that generalized study and apply those conclusions to such a such a broad population.
Exactly. And another topic I'd like to touch is just the importance of context. People are they're very quick to compare Asian Americans who've had these educational experiences and opportunities to African Americans who, the majority of them have been brought here unwillingly to the United States, put into bondage as slaves, and forced into a situation that no human being would ever want to be placed into. So by making a comparison like that, people are assuming that by directly comparing them, it's all as though you're not at all giving any consideration into the context of the situation, which in this situation is very important because the economic turmoil of one individual, which in this case would be the African American, is heavily due to context. Look at context. Look at the Jim Crow laws. Look at sharecropping. Look at white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan. Look at all these different uh, institutions like slavery in the United States that have directly been intended to impede the progress of African Americans in the United States. And this is something that's really important, must be considered. Another thing that's really another stereotype that's just ridiculous is the idea of Native Americans being lazy, which I've seen that online, and it's ridiculous. Again, you have to consider the situation. Don't forget that Native Americans were the ones who were first from here. They're the ones who used all the resources sparingly, respectfully, didn't kill millions of buffalo and bison just to, take
Their hides and just leave their bodies out to waste.
and also they're uh, they're often depicted in those ways as, oh, savages. And now people are gonna appropriate certain aspects of their culture and it's just very racist. But don't forget and that the story of a Native American is very complex when you think about the context. First of all, think about the disease that came when the Europeans came all the way from Britain, Spain, France, even Holland or the Netherlands, and in Portugal. We're talking about Brazil. There are native people in the whole entire the two continents of the North America and South America. In that whole area, there were native peoples. Now, the destruction of the native peoples of their culture, even though native people still today are attempting to retain or to maintain their cultures and not assimilate completely into the now Western, quote unquote, Western civilization. Um, the the idea that the European ideals, Eurocentric principles, are ideal for a society is it's racist, and a lot of people try to describe Native American cultures as being savage. And I used to think that people were joking when they said that because I was like, that's ridiculous. But people actually mean it. And then some people say, oh, well, we came here and what we did was we helped civilize these people. And I said, okay, I guess you civilized people in the least civilized way possible by murdering them and then relocating them in an inhumane manner. So it's kind of hypocritical for you to say.
And when people make statements calling Native American cultures, savage, underdeveloped, uncivilized, it's very insulting and condescending and ignorant. Because when we look back at the Mayas, and the Mayas and their mathematics and their astronomy, their calendar, they were leaders in science and mathematics and doing things that places in Europe, many people in Europe couldn't do. And then we have, Tenochtitlan in Mexico City on the Lake Texcoco. And then you have the Incas in Peru who had those amazing structures built in the Andes Mountains, which is incredible that they were able to build that there. So when you're not calling native people civilized, that is an ignorant statement. There are civilizations all around the world. There are civilizations in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and Europe. But the idea of civilization being the implementation of European ideals around the world is just an extension of imperialism. And it attempts to discredit all the other cultures, their uniqueness, and their beauty.
But yeah, that's the gist of it. I think that these stereotypes are just ridiculous. They're not things that should be exactly considered. And yeah, the model minority myth is really destructive to people because it doesn't at all take into consideration the idea of context. And the idea of context is essential because without context, you're not going to be able to explain, oh, why have 400 years of oppression or 400 or 500 years of oppression and slavery. There's no way that could have impacted people to now be at a low socioeconomic status. Well, of course it can, because how is that not? A whole group of people being oppressed, given no actual liberty for many years, and then even after being given some sort of empty promise of freedom, which they weren't able to acquire completely, and still to a certain aspect today with police brutality and everything, complete freedom and equality has not happened. But those are just things that we have to consider. So Tej, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with me today. I really enjoyed talking about this. I know that this podcast is centered a lot around Hispanic culture, but I do want to open it up to different topics of race and ethnicity, especially here in the United States, since we live here. We live in the Bay Area, very, 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 very high Asian American population, probably one of the highest densities in all the United States. So most of my friends actually are Asian American, but this is something that has always been trivial, at least something I've always questioned my role as a Hispanic person in this society full of Asian Americans. And I think that being in a society with these people, I've also been in a community with a lot of academic rigor. And for that reason, I've been able to accomplish a lot. So I'm very appreciative of that. But of course, I'm never going to come to the assumption that inherently by being Asian American, you are more intelligent than me or less intelligent than me or that you're supposed to achieve more than everyone else just because of your race. So, Tej, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem, Sebastian. No, anytime.